Good evening. I'm Sarah Miglio, Dean of Curriculum and Advising. And before Dr. Alex Loney formally introduces our guest, I'd like to welcome you to our second evening focused on the relevance of Augustine's Confessions for today, the reader today. So as you know, our core book this year, and one of our required texts for the first year seminar, is Sarah Rudin's new translation of Augustine's Confessions. Our freshmen have been reading and discussing this translation, and so are our faculty and staff, and even our president, provost, and vice presidents have been reading along with us. So here's the thing. What we read shapes us. Our reading forms and corrects our thinking. When we read, we open ourselves up to the mentoring and teaching of the men and women who have gone before us, who aren't right here in our immediate context. Now, this solitary act of reading holds the power to transform us. And the transformative power of reading only increases when we read and discuss together in community. Like you, I'm already being changed as I read Confessions alongside each of you. My hope and prayer for Wheaton College and our community is that God will use our deliberate choice to read and talk about this book and this story to turn each of us individually and as a collective towards him. So tonight we have the honor of hearing Sarah Rudin's lecture. And following her lecture, we'll have a brief time of conversation with Dr. Amy Pillar of the School of Bible and Theology and Dr. Jim Wilhoit of Christian Formation and Ministry Department. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Alex Loney of the Modern and Classical Languages Department.
I'll just say a few words because you came here to hear Sarah talk and not me. But let me just say that it's a real pleasure, I think, for us to host her. She's a remarkable combination of professional writer, classicist, and poet. And she's kind of have a remarkable life path to get there, too. This deep training in the classics through a PhD from Harvard in classics, taking her through a remarkable teaching and writing career, which she shared some of the details with me about yesterday, from South Africa to Connecticut, and then through this sort of developing her knowledge and depth in the classics through the practical work of translating some difficult, interesting, bizarre texts from antiquity. The Lysistrata, the Golden Ass, a really bizarre book that if you want to read something wild, someday try it, which incidentally inspired C.S. Lewis to write perhaps his best novel, Till We Have Faces. And even the Oresteia, which is perhaps the most difficult and beautiful thing ever written in antiquity, which I'm amazed that she took that on. And anyway, this all is just part of this developing knowledge that she took through and I think shows what a testament the kind of training and experience that is for somebody to use when they come to Christian thought and texts. So one of the things she did recently too was grapple with Paul as somebody who had that kind of deep knowledge and training and experience in the classics, and produced this neat little volume, Paul Among the People, which really looks closely at kind of what Paul's place was like as somebody who was educated and grew up and lived and ministered in this Greco-Roman world. And it shows in many ways that Paul was not quite, well, to certain detractors, was not as dangerous as we might think he was, but revolutionary in a really profound way for that society. And converted, well, maybe I shouldn't say converted, maybe I should say helped encourage Sarah to become no longer a Paul skeptic, but a Paul supporter, let's say. And that all led up to this most recent thing that she's done, this book, this translation of the Confessions, a really beautiful rendition of it into modern English, which I know many of you will be about to start reading, and I hope that you'll enjoy it as much as I have getting to read her version of this book. So please, if you would, with me, welcome Sarah to our stage.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your very warm welcome here. It's really been wonderful to be your guest. I can't say how much I appreciate it. One of the things I find most helpful about studying ancient literature is that it leads me to ask questions about my own society and myself that would never occur to me otherwise. It's often remarked that human beings normally go through most of our lives half awake. In the modern era, we get up and pour the Syntho cereal into the bowl as if this has been happening since the beginning of time. We stare blandly at the contents of a superstore for dogs and cats. We meekly register online on an events facilitation site, turning over personal data to a multinational corporation and an unlimited number of further data hunters, because this is now the only way on offer to say to a friend, "Yes, thank you, I'll come to your potluck." It doesn't look weird to us that the male newscaster is modestly covered in conventional business attire, whereas the female one apparently won't have time to change before leaving for the beach. Reading the literature of the ancient Mediterranean reminds me that things don't have to be the way we find them. Culture's quite different in different times and places, as in fact every piece of old and foreign literature shows. I can say a well-thought-out yes or no to any number of things, and I can try to persuade others to join me. But more importantly, reading sacred literature reminds me, in a very dramatic way, of the moral and spiritual charter, so to speak, that we have inherited. I can see inspired ideas arising in very unpromising circumstances. I can then think of all the choices over the centuries afterwards in support of a given idea, many of these choices made against the grain of prevailing authority and requiring great courage and sacrifice. This is the way such ideas are brought to reality on earth and fitted into a complex society. What's particularly inspiring to me when I read Augustine is his view of human beings, precious because of our creation by God and his loving care for all of us, love that in turn inspires us with love for each other. If this doesn't seem to be a radical, exciting idea, that's largely because people like Augustine were so successful in establishing it and made history move firmly in the idea's direction. We now have the privilege of the idea being commonplace, since our society was shaped around it. But in the ancient world, the idea was hardly commonplace. It was, in fact, nearly automatic and universal to place some human beings in a lower category than others through no fault of their own, and to mistreat and exploit them. Children, physically imperfect people, women, the poor, and foreigners were reflexively denied rights and freedoms and any claim to respect or regard. In this talk, I want to concentrate on children and slaves or servants. The New Testament strongly asserted that they were human beings. Here's just one example of a relevant passage, and you'll be able to think of several others, I know. In Mark 9, chapters 35 and following, Jesus is a guest in a house, and he insists on the humanity of two classes of people under that roof who would have been ignored, the servants and the children. and he actually places them in special categories. So this is my own translation. Then he sat down and called the 12 and said to them, if someone wants to be first, he must be last, and everyone's attendant. And it's actually, that's a more elevated word for servant, not just the ordinary servant, but say someone who assists in religious ceremonies. And he took a little child and stood it in the middle, where they could all see it, and he took it in his arms and said to them, whoever treats one of these children as a guest in my name treats me that way, and whoever treats me that way does it not to me, but to the one who sent me. Now, that translation is going to be unfamiliar to you, I'm sure. Treating the children as guests. But from Homeric times onward, the single most frequent meaning of the verb here, dekomai, when it's used for social situation, is entertain as a guest. Even when the verb was used for mere objects, one common meaning is to receive graciously. Interestingly, in connection with this passage of Mark, the first instance of the verb, when it's used for persons, that it has a background, in the Iliad, book 6, line 483, Andromache is taking the baby to her bosom from her husband, and her husband and she have just had a very loving, friendly chat. And it's a tender scene between the couple. But in a formal social setting in the ancient world, children do not get personal attention from strangers, let alone any elevated guest friendship in their own right. Jesus is giving instructions of challenging absurdity when, as a guest himself, he makes the small child the focus of the gathering. He kneels or stoops to embrace it and designates it as the proper recipient of hospitality, which includes all sorts of traditional attendance, that is, attention from servants, bathing, a soft couch, the best food and drink in the house, and respectful conversation with other guests. In the Roman novel Satyricon, written by a courtier of Nero who was a contemporary of the Apostle Paul, one thing that helps a dinner party dissolve into revolting chaos is that two adults bring children and draw attention to them. These are little slave boys whose owners are using them for sex, and in the pagan view, this, and not the child rape, is the faux pas. Anyway, these two adults indulge them socially, and chaos ensues. One of the boys, for example, starts a dog fight that breaks all the crystal dishes on the table and spatters the guests with hot oil. Even in conservative Palestinian Jewish society of the time, which was far more conscientious in the treatment of children, a young child was not considered a full member of society or detachable in his experience from his parents. To cap the strangeness of the scene in Mark, Jesus is a guest himself as he rewrites the rules here. And then he says, you know these verses, whoever sets a trap for one of these, a stumbling block is the ordinary term in translations. One of these little people, that's what the Greek says literally, who trust in me, it's better for him to have a millstone, a big one, drawn by a donkey, hung around his neck and be thrown into the sea. Around 3 centuries later, Augustine, in what is often called the first autobiography, the Confessions, takes up these issues in a very striking way. Technically, legally, Augustine himself is a Roman father. He owns his child and has life and death power over him. And what was, as a rule, more interesting to Roman fathers than babies and toddlers? Well, everything on earth was more interesting to them than babies and toddlers. Moreover, Augustine's son, Adeodatus, and it means given by God, is illegitimate. There is no traditional expectation that Augustine ever acknowledged that the child exists. Nevertheless, he clearly reveals in his story of his life that he haunted the nursery of this child. He was very interested in him. He had the child lovingly educated. He proudly acknowledged him, and he mourned for him pitifully when he died as a teenager. And he shows, through the narrative of the confessions, that he took a really tender interest in the baby, his baby son, who would normally be on his own and probably left outdoors to die or to be picked up by a slave dealer. That was the normal fate of children born outside legitimacy. Here's a passage from Confessions. This is Book 1, sections 11 and 12. Being weak, babies' bodies are harmless, but babies' minds aren't harmless. I myself have observed, carefully enough that I know what I'm writing about, a tiny child who was jealous. He couldn't speak yet, but his face was pale and had a hateful expression as he glared at the child who shared his nurse. Who doesn't know this happens? Well, in the ancient world, all adults know. All adults have no idea about this kind of scene, except if they're directly caring for babies. Mothers and nurses say that they avert this curse with one kind of cure or another. The alternative would be to believe that this is really harmlessness or innocence, where a wellspring of milk is flowing and overflowing from the very bosom of abundance. He doesn't tolerate an adjunct who absolutely needs this resource and is still drawing his life from this single food. But these things are gently put up with, not because they're nothing or because they're small matters, but because at a more advanced age they'll disappear. You can confirm this by the fact that you can't calmly endure the very same faults when you detect them in someone older. You, therefore, Master, who gave life to that baby and gave him a body which, as we perceive, you fitted out with the physical senses, you composed from various parts, you beautified with its shape, and for its wholeness and wholesome security, you placed in its bosom all the impulses of a living thing. You command me to praise you, even for these small things, and to make my testimony to you and chant psalms to your name, to you, the Most High, because you are God, all-powerful and good. And this would be the case even if you'd made nothing but these small things, as no one but you, the one, can make them. From you comes every form, from you who are most sublimely becoming, the most beautiful, that is, you who form all things and arrange all things in order through your law. So this is very interesting. You just follow this, the course of this thought as it develops in Augustine's mind. He's remembering seeing this tiny baby who had an expression of jealousy. And he was glaring, at the child who was sharing his nurse. And Augustine was just struck and impressed by this at the time and remembered all these decades later. And he goes from there to a rather sublime praise of God and, as the maker of such a child, whom the rest of the society is treating as a being with no inner life of any importance, really. There's a lot of modern indignation over Augustine's assertions about sin. Even babies, he insists, from the first hour of life are sinful. So how can we be critical, we exclaim, of a helpless, innocent baby we don't hold responsible for anything? As Augustine admits, we don't. This is disturbing, absolutely, but it's also clearly, in Augustine's mind, a way of including in the human family everyone who is born. You can't have wickedness in your mind unless you have a mind, a consciousness that is part of society, the network of attachments and needs. According to Christian ethics, your weakness is the reason to come to your aid and share with you the one thing that will save you from yourself, which is faith. You can be a woman, poor, a slave, a foreigner, very young, very old, sick, disabled, ignorant, unskilled, any vulnerable Homo sapiens, in short, but it doesn't matter. What's wrong with you is wrong with everyone. The highest potential in the universe belongs to you and to all other human beings. And here I just want to remark that I have my own pear tree interpretation that might work in parallel to this very scene. So why would we just spend time talking about this at all, writing about it, thinking about it? The fact that a little baby is jealous of the new baby who's come to nurse with him. Who on earth cares? Well, why do we care? And everyone who asks who reads the Confessions, I think, asks the same question: who cares about the pear tree? The fruit is useless. It is, human beings don't want to eat it. You might as well take it and throw it to the pigs. That's something to do with it, at least. And it's maybe a crime that was committed that no one, sort of so-called crime committed that no one ever noticed. And I think it's because the pear tree incident is momentous because of its triviality. So being a teenager, running around with your pals, nobody really noticing you, and you play a prank or you commit a petty crime, there are never any consequences. It's momentous because you are a human being, and there is nothing trivial about being a human being. Never in any moment of your life. It reminds me of a bit of Virginia Woolf. She's recalling her early childhood and her sense of consciousness of being alive. And she says, I believe she phrases it, she has a sense of how dangerous it is to be alive every moment. And Augustine also had this sense, and for him it was about the gifts and the risks of God's special creation, humankind. Anyway, the idea in the pre-Christian world was weird. And there wasn't, in pre-Christian literature really any language for it. But Augustine, I also want to mention, he also has a vivid sense of humanity of slaves and other people who normally, even at this relatively late time, tended to be regarded as only objects for labor and sexual exploitation. And that was unfortunately true among Christians as well as among pagans. And this is less vividly expressed in the Confessions than his regard for babies, but he does repeatedly refer to the parwoly little, extra little people, or simple, poor, uneducated people, many of whom would have actually been slaves. He stresses that because of their faith in God and because of their trust in human authority that derives from God, they are in less spiritual danger than a highly educated, proud, and argumentative man like himself, whose sin is worsened by the danger that he puts the parwoly in. So Augustine, as you'll find out, in reading the Confessions, was an obnoxious troll. And he got these ideas from the Manicheans, okay, from this far out heretical sect, who liked to lob, critical bombs at the New Testament in particular, and were just very skeptical in a sort of cheap way. And so Augustine himself set about, going and embarrassing Christian believers if they were more simple-minded and telling them how stupid they were to believe any of this. In other literary works, sermons and letters particularly, he addresses the plight of slaves, highlighting their vulnerability to physical abuse. In a review of my own translation, Peter Brown talks about a new set of recently discovered Augustine letters published by Johannes, I can't pronounce this, Diviak in 1981. And they show how active Augustine was in combating the kidnapping of poor peasants to sell as slaves and in rescuing them. And he describes a sympathetic interview he had with a young girl who had been enslaved. And she was one of 130 people the church had bought back at this point. And this is a very interesting matter of vocabulary here. Who knows how does our word redemption derive? What did it mean in Latin? What's the Latin word behind it? Oh, someone. Latin student. Yes. Sorry? I can't hear you, I'm sorry. Is it Demeter?
She wants to say re emptor.
To buy back. To buy back. Is that what you're telling me?
I had a different one, but...
Yeah. She said a different one. She wants to say re emptor.
Re emptor. Well, that's just another Latin word. Oh, yes, that's the person who does it. Okay, I'm getting it now. All right, I'm sorry, thick head. Yeah, the person who, did I ask for a translation of Redeemer? No, redemption, okay, all right, sorry. We're just in different parts of speech here. Sorry about that. Yeah, well, the idea behind the word is to buy back out of slavery or captivity. Okay. In another rather ambivalent passage of the Confessions, Augustine gets briefly inside the experience of a slave who can never escape the very hard fate that comes from the pure accident of whom he was born to, a slave mother. His father may have been the master himself, but no one knew or cared. To add insult to injury, the slave's birth and the birth of his master's own legitimate son have been made the object of a scientific study on the validity of horoscopes. So you can imagine this scene here, or this whole episode. So there are two friends, okay? And they are researching whether horoscopes mean anything or not. And they've been sort of at this for a long time. They've been collecting data. And so they've been looking at litters of puppies and kittens, and farm animals. And they've been casting horoscopes for them. So they've been trying to find out whether the stars can predict what's going to happen to all these creatures who have been born. And then, aha! A servant girl and the wife of one of these guys get pregnant at the same time. And it looks like they're going to give birth at the same time. So these two men, these true Roman gentlemen, get hugely excited about that. So they're going to make a scientific study of it. So, and they're tracking it very, very closely. They have both women under observation. Imagine what it feels like to be these women. And as it happens, according to the story anyway, these babies are born at the exact same time. So messengers are running back and forth, reporting on the progress of labor. And actually, the babies are born at the same time. So their horoscopes are identical. But one of them grows up to be a Roman gentleman. He has education, he has travel, he has luxury, he has slaves of his own. He has the whole world at his feet. The other one is born a slave. And Augustine sort of remarks, he makes this low-key remark, but it's sort of a pitying remark. He says, well, yeah, and I was told that this slave was still alive, and he was, still in the most abject condition. He was still suffering. He was still, ground under the feet of privileged people. So, but they had exactly the same horoscope. So it's a very odd kind of narrative that Augustine's engaged here. Yeah, he notices the sort of human disaster that this experiment represents. That these people are born very close to the same place at exactly the same time, and then one is destined to have everything. The other one is destined to have nothing, to do nothing but suffer. I mean, it takes Augustine, I think, a lot longer to really digest the problem here and to make it more to bring it alive in his mind. But it certainly did come alive in his mind because he was, we know, quite concerned over the course of his career with the treatment of slaves. And there's one really striking sermon. He talks to the men in his congregation, and he says they've been showing off bruises. They've been beaten up and whacked around a little, and they're proud of it because they got the bruises from raping their slave women. And so he puts it to them directly, how on earth can you as Christians do this? And they, of course, this is the way a master had always been able to behave to his slave. He wasn't answerable to anybody. Suddenly, he's answerable and he's confronted with it in public. So it's just, for me, that's a momentous moment in the history of our civilization. Yeah, you can't do this. They're human beings too. So how am I doing with time here? Just a few more minutes. Okay. For Augustine, the sense of how wonderful and how dangerous it was to be a human being was very fraught. He was a real individual with very special needs. He was a vivid modern type we have long revered and, I'm perceiving, are now getting rather sick of. The born writer, someone who can't be happy except in intellectual exploitation and literary self-expression. If we're looking for a modern exemplar, we probably couldn't get closer than C.S. Lewis, who was a poet as a young man, and by his late teens, he knew that he had better be a professor, as there was no other paying line of work he was suited for. Augustine was a more extreme type, as he found teaching and heading a household so alienating and exhausting as to cause emotional and physical breakdown, whereas Lewis managed, on these same social and professional fronts and did not seek contemplative withdrawal and a life without worldly responsibilities and rewards. And Augustine, of course, did. But what these two men had in common was that, however special they were and knew themselves to be, they found the prestigious, outwardly successful, mundanely exalted human self to be, on its own strength, quite sickening, lonely, confusing, full of pretension, intellectually and emotionally unsatisfying to the degree that made faith a literal compulsion. The meaning of life in the universe, the need for a relationship with God pursued them, were undeniable. These two men made essentially the same compromise. If society valued nothing higher than the sovereign literary man, and they had already more or less achieved, this pinnacle, then they were going to be God's literary men and use their talents to consolidate and enlarge Christianity and to vigorously assert that the spiritual dangers were less for simpler, humbler people. They were going to fight against the power-hungry false prophets who were keen to mislead these people. Everyone, they never stopped insisting, ironically by means of their superior talents and the greater reach of their communications, had the same glory and shame as human beings, ipso facto. These two paragons of individual literary achievement in the name of Christianity, two extremely different cultures, made fundamentally the same conclusion. Here, I think it's worth asking, 1,600 years after Augustine, half a century after Lewis, where the heck we think we are as human beings, as individuals. I would like to suggest that we've come farther toward the wild blue yonder in that half century than in the previous 15 and a half, and outpaced the pagan Greeks and Romans in certain kinds of idolatry, which to me means basically trying to turn spiritual humanity into a material object. How do we think that right now we can come closer to vindicating what God created, the real, God-given, irreplaceable self, full of eternal potential and eternal peril?
Sarah, thank you so much for giving us so much to think about Augustine, Scripture, and humanity. You mentioned at the beginning that translating ancient texts give you new questions to ask about yourself and society. Maybe you gave us one of those questions right at the end, but I wonder if you might elaborate about that just a bit in Confessions. What were some of the questions that you realized you'd never ask about yourself or society until you had done this work?
Well, I'm in a really embarrassing position because, I am a writer, I bought in very young and for a large part of my life, into the sort of idolatry of the writer that's really prevalent in this society. I more or less staked my life on it. So we all know the story. You can see it in 50 different movies and read about it in 100 different novels. The writer is the individual who whose talent raises him above ordinary society, and it's the girl whose mom says do the dishes, and whose mom is later, proven totally wrong. This girl should be instead glorified for her talent instead of doing the silly dishes. So that's the story that we've told ourselves as a culture. It's a total lie, but it's the kind of story that we are, I was certainly completely sucked into. That it's the story essentially that the self, the individual self, is circular. It exists to express itself. That's it. That's totally it. So it's a horrifying thing when I just put it into words like that. But that's what we're told to believe. Ew.
So I'd be interested a little bit in how your understanding of Augustine changed over the course of translating. Did he seem to appear the same at the end as he had at the beginning, or did this prolonged time with his text lead to new insights into this person?
Yeah, sorry. I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
Well, really, how sitting with the Confessions changed your view of the person of Augustine?
Oh, yeah, tremendously. It's similar to the way that sitting with Paul changed my view of Paul, because we tend to have our views, of these people through the popular media, so we get them in second or third or fourth hand. We're not listening to the words of the people themselves, let alone listening really carefully. And I was just taking on this project. I had to listen really carefully to what Augustine was telling me. I had to see, how hard he worked to make an impression on everyone, educated people, ordinary people, all people, with his words, how urgently, he wanted attention for his message, and this represented really, really selfless work. It's thought that he was dictating this. The only reason the Confessions exist was that he got really sick, and he was laid up in his room, and he didn't want to waste the time, so he couldn't do his ordinary duties, which were very numerous and onerous. So he's laid up in his room, so he calls one or two scribes. He has people taking down his words normally. So he just starts pouring out the story. And even though he's very likely in a lot of pain and he's really weak, he just can't stop telling the story. And simultaneously, he's telling what it means, what he thinks it means. He's asking what it means. He's talking to God this whole time. So it's just, when you think about this scene, it's just beautiful, as it's a very strong self. This guy he's got style, he's got energy, and he's got very strong opinions. But it's not about him. He's doing this for other people. And he created the first really blockbuster work for Christians in late antiquity. This may be a work as important in sustaining Christianity in very difficult times as the Gospels were, sustaining it early on, because this was a time of barbarian invasions and great breakdowns in civilization. And Augustine himself died under a barbarian siege. Rome had been sacked a few years earlier. So one thing that carried Christian civilization through was that people had a huge reverence for Augustine's thought and his writings. And particularly this, they just loved this book. You have people, in the Dark Ages in Britain, Alfred the Great loved the Confessions. This book just went on and on and on. It was like a machine, and just plowed through all the hardships and doubts and divisions that were going to afflict Christianity, and so that the basic ideas of Christianity could endure.
You've given us, even this evening, and obviously through your work, a really compelling picture of him that makes him seem though he be distant in time, actually quite close to us. This compelling picture of seeing humanity in everyone. And I want to go back and now reread some of the passages on children and slaves, so thank you for that. I wonder if I might, though, ask a kind of hard question, one that comes up as I have read this text with students, that he seems quite distant from us in how he thinks about relationships between men and women.
Right, yeah.
Is there a similar way that we can understand him better in those places, or is he teaching us something that we need to hear? I'm sure you get this question quite a bit, but how do you deal with his perspectives on romantic relationships or sexuality?
Oh, that's just, it's a very good and very hard question. By the time he was writing, the cult of celibacy and the cult of virginity were very well established. So a lot of Christians were worshiping not so much God, but their own untouched bodies. It was sort of an inheritance of elite classicism that you look down on women and any kind of call that women had on your life, as a husband, as a son. We see that in Augustine. As a son, as a husband, as a father, as somebody engaging in ordinary business, making money, supporting a household. From Plato on, probably even before Plato, elite men had been saying, we're above all this. We don't even talk to women. Our minds are so far above all of this nonsense, all of this worthless stuff of the world, including marrying, having children, that we're going to form our own societies. And to some degree, yeah, Augustine's there with both boots on. He talks about, I find this a really hilarious passage because it's so ironic in his words as he looks back. He's gotten together, he's now teaching in Italy, and he has a group of young men who are intellectually aspiring, and I think most of them are Christian, but in any case, they're very pretentious, and very. They think themselves way too good for anything that they're actually doing, to advance their careers, to start families, and so on. So they decide they're going to form their own little society, and they're going to go off. There are one or two of them with a lot of money. So these people are going to endow this society, and they're going to take turns running it. Each one is going to do a stint as administrator, and the rest are just going to sit around and think great thoughts and be waited on by slaves, of course. So they're going to do nothing. And this is their idea of the good life. And then I started thinking, about the practicalities of it. And, oh gosh, some of them are married. And what are their wives going to think about this? And it's sort of an afterthought as he depicts it. But it's really, I think he's being funny. Because Augustine, to give him credit, he didn't say, that it's okay to abandon your lawful wedded wife or your children. And he certainly didn't abandon his son after his conversion. So, yeah, you get this strain of really kind of annoying masculinity, this really superior attitude where the men are going to go, they're going to be the contemplatives, and they're going to pray and read and have conversations all day. And the women and the slaves are going to wait on them, and not even have family life, not even have children. The women are going to be doing basically nothing in this big project. They're not going to be the spiritual beneficiaries of it. So that's awfully annoying, and I've got, really no more to say about it. I don't know. But one thing that I have to keep in mind, and I always keep in mind with my authors, is the need to be as sympathetic as possible with them and not censor them and give them a very good presentation. Make their own words show them in the best light possible.
So on that, if you could speak to Augustine face to face, what questions would you have for him?
I would ask him, I'd say to him, come on, there's one really, touching and painful scene toward the, late in the Confessions, and he's writing about himself, in his present position. He's very high up in the church, very influential, very dedicated. And he's in the scene, he's taking a journey, and he sees this dog chasing a hare, and he's been talking about how amazing nature is and how he can just stare at a lizard, or a spider. He just stare and be entranced by it. But he doesn't let himself, because basically it's because the lizard or the spider or the hare is not God himself. And you have to always have your mind fixed on God. And, I would tell him, I don't think that's the way God meant us to live. Get off your donkey, sit on the ground, and watch the dog hunt the hare. If God loves you, God wants you to be able to do that. Life is given to us to enjoy. We can be happy in just very ordinary ways. We don't have to be the greatest, the most virtuous, the most dedicated, the most holy of all. I think God puts us where we need to be and doing what we need to do. We can love it. We can enjoy it for itself.
It seems like God has put you in the place to be very skilled with words. I mean, you've talked a bit about the idolatry of an author, but to bring voice to someone from a different time, to represent them in the best way possible is, it seems, an amazing calling and gift. There's many students here tonight probably that do work of translation from ancient languages or modern. So could we hear a little bit about the nuts and bolts? What does it look like to sit down with an ancient text? What does that process look like? What is the day in the life of a translator?
Oh my goodness, this is going to be so embarrassing. Okay, so my husband and I, it's time to get up. And we're both kind of jockeying to see who's going to get up and walk the dog, who's going to get up first. And so one of us gets up and walks the dog, and the other one's making breakfast. And and things just sort of happen all day. And I've been translating long enough that I actually have this need to work. I'm used to it. I'm accustomed to it, so it just happens. But I got there by being by actually, having to make money from translating, or I would starve. That was where I was for a long time. So I had to, put in the hours and work really hard and try to produce something impressive, or I was not going to have money. I would literally not be able to buy food. So nothing can motivate you like that. But then doing it, I found, and I was doing it because it proved that I was really not very good at anything else. So here I was stuck in a corner, and I was going to do this work and succeed in it, or I would starve. So I did it. And then I found I really liked it. So this is embarrassing, and do not take an example from me, but I do it kind of, I do it the same way I check email. I do it the same way I call friends or go get a snack because I really want to do it. But that takes about 30 years.
Well, I'd be interested that there are, the confessions are filled with scriptures and portrayals of Augustine's multifaceted relationship with the Bible, when he's put off by the poor translations to when he discovers Paul and discovers the Psalms. What can students learn from the confessions about how to read Scripture well?
That's a good and hard question. Augustine knew Scripture so well that it was in his bones. It was part of his language. So he combines it with the language of classical literature and rhetoric, and he comes up with something just beautiful, amazing, inspired. And much of the time it's just wrong. It has nothing to do with what the Greek and Hebrews said, and he knows Scripture through Latin, through bad Latin translations. But, his idea is, God's love is enough. It is enough to inspire him. It is enough to guide him. And the church, of course, plays a role in this too, in having its doctrine, which serves as a general guidance in life. So he just has an incredible, within that structure, he's got an incredible confidence, and he has genuine fun. He's punning all over the place about the Bible. He's making up scenes. Many are just fanciful and crazy, and cartoonish. And he's just putting this all together with prayer, with confession, with a scientific speculation. It's just sort of all coming together and just bursting out of him in this gorgeous, complicated prose. I don't know if that, sets much of an example for people like us. How would we do this? But maybe one general lesson is that the Bible is gorgeous. The Bible is a treasure. It's a joy. It's a gift. It's not it's certainly not a punishment. It's not a restriction. It is there for us to enjoy.
Thank you.
Amen to that.
Yeah. Right.
That's a bit of a wonderful, specific question, but I want to ask a more general one. Many of our students, the first-year students, will start to read Confessions next week. Some may have already started, but many will come to that quite quickly. So for a reader who hasn't come to this text before, do you have any pieces of advice? Themes to look for, ways of reading? How can they approach this text well?
Some of it will require some patience, because Augustine is, well, it just really helps to appreciate how overexcited he is. He is. This is a man who is just permanently infatuated with God, and this is his love letter to God. So he doesn't care how long it takes, how many digressions it takes him on. He's just talking to God. He'll ask God. There are hundreds of rhetorical questions in this work. He just says, God, well, is it this, is it that, is it the other thing? And he just plays with words, and he asks God nonsensical questions. He doesn't care about the answers. He's just, if you think about it, not as something that you have to pin down objectively at every point and understand completely and get some purposeful meaning out of everywhere. Well, if you go that way, you're not going to enjoy this the way you should. I think you should, set yourself free to grasp it emotionally before you start, looking for, theological lessons in it. Just kind of enjoy this guy enjoying God. That's what it's about.
So on reading this, what do students need to know about the Manicheans to be able to appreciate the book? Can you give a little overview of this group that he joined?
Okay, they are just a quick overview of Gnosticism. So it's a sort of big, broad, various set of they were later called heresies, or they actually were at the time, but not in our modern sense. These were alternate Christianities, and the word Gnostic it means it's about knowledge. So these were people who claimed a special, secret, sort of clubby knowledge of the divine. They had a special revelation that it was not available to ordinary people. And, if you read the Confessions, you get the idea that Augustine thinks they're the worst enemies of Christianity. He loathes them. He can't say bad enough things about them. And that's because of how different they were from the church of the big church of the time. Catholicus, which came to mean, the Catholic Church, all it meant was general or universal. The church that he calls in Latin Catholicus is just the universal church. That means anybody can come. You don't have to have special knowledge or money or connections. You have nothing. And the ritual is very simple. You basically have two. There's baptism and there's ordination, if you're going to become a priest. And so this is the church for everybody. But the Manicheans were a Gnostic or Gnostic-related sect, which, they make Scientology look like Sunday school. They are so bizarre. If you want to read up on them, there's a good book by Robin Lane Fox about the Confessions, and I can't remember the title, but it's his latest book about Augustine, and he has this long chapter about the Manicheans, which it's absolutely hard to believe, but you can sort of put it in the context of cults that arise nowadays. So you get this charismatic popular leader who says, who pops up and says, here's my mythology, and he comes up with this whole amazing, huge corpus of mythology in different Eastern languages. And he says, well, I'm Christ, and Scripture is nothing, and let me rewrite the whole thing for you. And I'm going to add a bunch of really crazy food fads, this really, really strange idea of vegetarianism. And you can only eat certain vegetables, and it's actually a sin. It's murder to eat anything unless you are in the Manichean elect, in the Manichean hierarchy, and then the food can be blessed for you. But otherwise, you're committing murder when you pick a fig off a tree. And Augustine has a passage about this. Yeah, it was a cult, and it had really bizarre practices. And it would it worked to suck people in. So it had very time-consuming, expensive rituals that you would be waiting on these Manichean elect, or the hierarchy, to feed them every day. He did this, though. He spent years of his life in this cult, and then he turned on them. Well, first just walked away from them, but the more he was integrated into the regular church, the more he reacted with just hateful passion against them for the amount of his life that they had wasted.
Well, we've had a great time talking about confessions this evening, but I'm curious, as a scholar, what's next for you? What's next on the horizon of your projects?
Well, I'm working on a new Gospels translation.
Right.
So that's going to be, it's proving very interesting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, really appreciated your reading of Mark 9. That was incredibly helpful. That was the gospel text, for those of you who know 2 weeks ago, so it was really wonderful to hear that again.
Thank you so much.
New way.
Thank you.
I guess my final question, one that I know some students had raised for colleagues, was tell us a little bit more about your choice of the word master instead of Lord.
Okay. Well, I got into a lot of trouble for it, but from a scholarly and historical point of view, this was sort of the easiest word choice in the whole book. The Latin word is dominus, and it means the houseman. So it's the head of a household. The head of the household, he owns everyone in the house, wife, children, slaves. And he has life and death power over them. And that's what a dominus was. And it wasn't used only in very nasty connections was it used for, in a political sense. So a couple of emperors had declared them, they became really bad tyrants, and they declared themselves Dominus et Deus, Lord and God. The God part was less offensive than Dominus. Because, since the first emperors, the emperor was God. He was deified, and people were, pagans were just fine with it. They loved it, especially the good emperors being God. That's great, so they worshipped all over the empire, and sort of daily, this is part of your daily routine. But for a leader to declare himself Dominus, your owner, and take away any political liberty that you had, that was absolutely offensive and wrong. So it's unthinkable that a Roman like Augustine would be thinking politically when he calls somebody Dominus. No, he means God is the slave owner. God is the head of the household, and he uses. He actually keeps using this metaphor, that Augustine says, he's the runaway, God is after him, God whips him, and he's completely dependent on God, God owns him, but of course, this means that he is spiritually free. So, yeah, I think on those grounds it was a total no-brainer. This is what he means. That's what the Latin word means, and especially in this context.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, we are so very grateful for your good work and for your time with us. We have learned a lot, and we are excited to continue to learn with you and with this text. Will you join me, please, in expressing your thanks?
Thank you.
to
Thanks a
Sarah?
lot. Thanks.